Bruno Carvalho is a professor of Romance languages and literature and affiliated professor in African and African American studies and urban planning and design at Harvard University. He has published widely on cities as lived and imagined spaces, with emphasis on urbanization processes in Brazil from the 18th century onward. And like yesterday, each panelist will be speaking 20 minutes, and then we'll have an hour for discussion before the coffee break. Bruno.
Before lunch.
Before lunch. We have lunch after, no coffee break. Thank you.
Bom dia. Pediram para eu falar.
Asked to speak in English, and as I'm obedient, I'm going to change languages. Obrigada a todos por estarem aqui, especialmente os nossos colegas no Brown, Jim e Ramon, e todos os por organizarem uma conferência tão urgente e necessária com pessoas, um grupo tão excepcional. Para mim é uma honra.
Hordge-Freeman, who's an associate professor of sociology at the University of South Florida. She specializes in racism, inequality, and exploitation in black families, and is the author of a book I admire tremendously, The Color of Love, Racial Features, Stigma, and Socialization in Black Brazilian Families, published by the University of Texas Press in 2015. We'll then hear from Celso Rocha de Barros, who received his BA in Political Science and MA in Sociology from the Universidade Estadual de Campinas, the Unicamp, and a doctorate from Oxford University in Sociology, and who writes a weekly column that always reminds me of my own opinions in the Folha de São Paulo. And he's currently writing a book many of us are eagerly waiting for on the Workers' Party. Last, we'll hear from Marlon Weichert, who's currently acting as Deputy Federal Attorney for Citizens' Rights. And he's been a federal prosecutor in Brazil since 1995, working on a wide range of human rights issues with special emphasis in transitional justice initiatives, business and human rights, public security, and the public health system. So, without further ado, Elizabeth, please.
Ok, muito obrigada por estarem aqui.
To you all today and to really talk about the political context in Brazil. So I initially struggled to organize my thoughts related to this broad topic of the political context in Brazil, largely because there are a number of things that I could have potentially discussed. But ultimately, I decided to take advantage of this invitation to comment on how the current political context impacts the groups that have been most central to my research. And so in this presentation, I'll explore what the rise of Bolsonaro, for example, and conservatism in Brazil means for Black women, for Black families, and for domestic workers, all of whom are the focal points of my research in Brazil. So from the onset, I think it's important to establish that my commentary on this topic is very much rooted in a type of transnational Black feminist tradition. What that means is that my analysis is concerned with understanding how Black women's experiences are a function of their interlocking oppression. So the argument being that we need to consider race, class, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, among other identities, to be able to understand domination in their lives. This perspective also demands a type of self-reflexivity and asserts that individuals who experience subjugation in their daily lives are in the best position to explain it. So their reflections and interpretations of their reality should be taken seriously. It also views research as being inherently political, which means that it can and should not only describe conditions, but challenge dominant hierarchies of power and empower marginalized communities, especially Black women in this case, to change their conditions on their own terms. So there's a rich tradition to draw on as it relates to this particular perspective in Brazilian studies, in particular in Brazil. So some of the folks who come to mind, at least as it relates to Brazilian research, are people like Sueli Carneiro, Leilia Gonçalves, Djamila Ribeiro, North American scholars such as Frances Wendens Twine, Kia Lily Caldwell, Keisha Kahn Perry, among a number of them who do this and offer a model of what it looks like when ethnography and research centers the experiences of Black women to have a better sense of how oppression functions. Now, while the topic of this panel is Brazil today, and really of this Congress, the conference is Brazil today, I want to begin my presentation by reconnecting us to a Brazilian figure of yesterday, of yesteryear. The one thing that my time and experience has taught me about Brazil is that any assessment of its current situation requires that we reflect on the country's past, with attention to the voices and lives that have often been relegated to the margins, when included at all. So in this case, I return to the case of Joanna, a woman of indigenous and African origins whose story of survival in the 18th century helps us to understand what Brazilians, and particularly Black Brazilian women, are up against in the 21st century. So briefly, to 18th century scholars of historians of emancipation and slavery in Brazil, Joanna is a well-known figure because she sold herself into slavery. And this is important. In Joanna's calculations, the instability, insecurity, and brutality of poverty as a free woman was such that she determined it more beneficial to negotiate her own enslavement than to live as a free woman. Her logic was strikingly simple, right? Slave masters are required to house, feed, and shelter their slaves. So as an enslaved woman, she would have her basic necessities met. Moreover, and most importantly, unlike enslaved persons who encountered the day-to-day brutalities of harsh working conditions under slavery, Joanna was able to use her legal position and use legal mechanisms to negotiate not only the terms of her enslavement, but also the amount of her sale. In accordance to this legal contract, she could keep the proceeds and use them as she saw fit, and in order to, as she quote says, live her own liberty. So inevitably, when faced with this biography, the question that people tend to ask is why? But rather than frame this conundrum as a question of an unreasoned individual, I ask, what is the state of a society where freedom comes with such misery that individuals are faced with decisions like these? What type of Brazil did Joanna live in where negotiated enslavement became the best option? And more importantly, for this research I conduct on modern Brazil and our concerns about democracy, what does it mean that similar calculations have been faced all along throughout the history of Brazil and are only amplified in Bolsonaro's Brazil? So as a sociologist for the past 10 years, I've traveled to Brazil collecting narratives, conducting research with Black families and collecting narratives with Black Brazilian women who live as filhas de criação. And admittedly, I'm in the throes of completing a book on this topic. And so it feels as though every fiber of my existence most recently has been directed towards finishing this project. And for those of you who've been fortunate enough to not have me corner you and obsessively talk to you about filhas de criação, I want to tell you a little bit about them and why they're so important to my work. So filhas de criação is a term that's often used to refer to Brazilian women from poor families who are taken in by wealthy families under the guise of adoption. So overwhelmingly, these poor Black and brown women are referred to as informally adopted or foster daughters. But this language obscures the principal reason for their presence in these homes, which is to provide unpaid labor in exchange for housing and food. So my research on filhas de criação focuses mainly on Black Brazilian women between the ages of 30 and 80 years old who continue to live as filhas de criação and in some cases have dedicated several decades of their life to providing unpaid labor to these families. Now, I argue that this group represents one of the most vulnerable groups in Brazil because in many ways they are hidden in plain sight. Their position results from them from coming from very poor families of color, not occupying the same position as a full family member in their adoptive families, and they complete the work of domestic workers without having any type of formal affiliation with being a domestic worker. So they are poised to be distinctly, impacted by the current administration's positions that impact family and impact those who are domestic workers. So by taking a closer look at the way that the political context will impact family and labor and how this relates to the lives of filhas de criação, we can better understand the social implications of the current policies and the impact that they might continue to have. Now, some of the most significant social programs developed by previous administrations was the Bolsa Familia program. And I'm going to leave it to the experts to talk about the intricacies of that. But what I will say is that this aggressive social program was fundamental in terms of addressing some of the issues that Brazil was facing with poverty and hunger. So it impacted several millions of Brazilians around the country with these conditional cash transfers. And many of these cash transfers were predicated on this requirement that families keep their children in school. There's this requirement of medical checkups and immunizations. All of these things have been great. But what I've been most interested in is looking at what those outcomes have been. And what researchers have found is that this initiative has led to lower dropout rates and increased rates of grade promotion, increased health outcomes. But while Bolsa Familia has had tremendous successes, just 2 weeks ago, Bolsonaro, citing incorrect information, stated that who he refers to as filhos de Bolsa Familia suffer from intellectual issues that would make it difficult for them to be successful in life. And that até com boas escolas, even with the best schools, there were concerns about whether or not they would be able to make a good living, make a contribution. At the same time, there's also reports that he actually might be warming up to the idea of supporting Bolsa Familia with the idea that he might be able to garner support among the Northeast if he did that. But it's still unclear. And so while he decides on that, though, hunger continues to be a real issue in Brazil, and Bolsa Familia offers a direct intervention into this problem for families, particularly for Black families. In nearly all of the interviews that I conducted with filhas de criação, for example, a major motivation for them being transferred to these wealthier families was this question of hunger and poverty. And just to give you an example of that, one of them says, "You know what it is for my mother to wake up and not have anything to put in a pot to give us, to have a whole day of eating be just tea because it was all we had to make, because the tea came from the herbs in our own garden. So neither me nor my sisters hold anything against my mother, because it's like she was a warrior, a batalhadora. Because for a person to give her children away, do you understand? She gave us away so that we would not, because she did not have anything to put on the table. Hunger, it was hunger." And so this reflection is really an extension of the types of narratives that came from other women who talked about what were some of the catalyzing forces that led their families into criação, that led them to accept this offer to help them, that wealthier families provided. So in this sense, continuing social programs, for example, like Bolsa Familia, which provide necessary financial support for families to maintain their children in the household and encourages them to send them to school, this has actually made it less likely for these young girls to be sent away than they were in the past. And so it's this outcome that's potentially threatened by a president or a wave of a political movement that's antagonistic to programs who helps populations because they are deemed to be, quote unquote, beyond reform. But the current political context also has implications for domestic law and reform. A legacy of slavery, as many of you know, Brazil has the largest population of domestic workers in the world. So over 7 million women, about 20% of all workers, all domestic workers worldwide reside in Brazil. And they're primarily indigenous women and Afro-Brazilian women. As recently as March 2013, Brazil passed some of the most wide-reaching legislation, which really made some significant gains. So widespread were these initiatives that it's been called the second abolition of slavery. And the results were really a product of the hard-fought efforts of domestic rights organizations, activists, including international mobilization. All of these efforts culminated in unemployment benefits, overtime pay, safety and health standards needing to be met, and also paid leave. And so for the first time, this law established a domestic worker as a professional who should be accorded rights and responsibilities. But recent political transitions means that those gains have also come under attack. As early as 2017, Michel Temer signed the labor reform bill, which in many ways loosens the labor laws by extending the minimum of time a worker can work per day from 8 to 12, and limiting what is considered time at work. For his part, Bolsonaro has previously voted against laws that would provide protections for domestic workers and in no unclear terms expressed antagonisms against the landless workers movement, the homeless workers movement, and the domestic workers movement. His perspective is that o trabalhador terá que escolher entre mais direito e menos emprego, ou menos direito e mais emprego. This was something that that really, I think, reflects his viewpoint on the rights of workers. So rollback on these gains mean that fewer domestic workers will have their carteira assinada. It increases their vulnerability, but it also creates a context for increased labor exploitation of children. And as it relates to this, I go back to one of my respondents who akins her experience of being a filha de criação as not being one of an adopted child, but one of being a victim of the tráfico de criança, so a child trafficking victim. Now, while these threats to progressive social programs and these rollbacks to labor reform are considered together, when they're considered together, there's certainly cause for concern. But what has been clear in the case of Brazil and around the world is where there is power, there is also resistance. And so we have the domestic workers unions who've been relentless in pushing back on some of those reforms, and even on some of the anti-activism that has been articulated by the president. But what I want to talk about is even beyond these more traditional forms of mobilization is really something that's happening online and in social media, which does not really get as much attention from researchers, but I think it really provides an opportunity for us to think about alternative forms of mobilization and the power that they have. So, for example, domestic workers have created a website with over a Facebook page of over 160,000 likes where they discuss their experiences. And this is a page that actually has had an important role in helping to mobilize these women who might not necessarily be part of formal groups. We have Ludmila Teixeira, who created the Women Against Bolsonaro movement, which has over 4 million members online and which was really fundamental to some of the organized protests around the country. And then, of course, we have the response around the murder of Marielle Franco that sparked not only a recognition of the importance of activism and recognition of the challenges that families and individuals in favelas are facing, particular people of color. It's also sparked a type of Black feminism in Brazil that is attentive to sexuality and that's appealing to a wider group of individuals than before. So I use these examples of the untraditional methods of resistance because they're necessary and because they enhance the formal forms of mobilization, but also because they represent a type of silver lining in all of this, right? There's a place of resistance. There's a way in which folks have organized in Brazil in ways that we haven't really seen in a long time. And so the ability to appeal to a larger audience has some potential in terms of thinking about citizenship and inclusion in these conversations. So what I want to do is conclude by saying there's still a great level of uncertainty as it relates to the current to the current policies and the political context. Bolsonaro has been unapologetic in his racist, classist, anti-homophobic, anti-women, the list goes on and on. Rollbacks to programs such as Bolsa Familia would have a devastating impact on families, on all poor families, but disproportionately Black and brown families who are recipients of these policies and programs. Likewise, the continual passage of policies that loosen protections against domestic workers are also likely to lead to the type of exploitation that the passage of that initial 2013 law had at least begun to challenge. So to conclude, I'd like to reiterate that what the story of Joanna, who I introduced in the beginning, tells us is that poor Black women and women of color in Brazil have the odds stacked against them, and they always have. But even so, they've always sought to carve out a space for themselves by any means necessary. What remains to be seen now is what it will mean for them to live their liberty in a country that might be referred to as Bolsonaro's Brazil, but is also very much their Brazil. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Celso Hordge-Barros, and I'm going to talk to you guys about, the political context of and the absolute collapse in which Bolsonaro was able to be elected president of Brazil. I wanted to thank Professor Green and all the others who have helped organize this conference. The opportunity to be here is a wonderful opportunity to be able to speak with you. Basically, I'm going to tell a story about two crises and one impeachment. So what happened in Brazil was a perfect storm. It was a confluence of various factors, and that didn't need to happen at the same time, but they did happen, and with disastrous consequences. And so, what happened in Brazil was three problems came together. First, one of the largest economic crises in history. Second, one of the biggest political crises in our history, which was precipitated by the discovery that lots of the Brazilian political system was corrupt and was accepting bribes. And third, the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, which was disastrous for her party and for those who supported her. You can see kind of the size of the economic collapse. In 2 years, Brazil lost 8% of its gross domestic product. It's a really big fall. You see this kind of thing when countries are at war, when they have some kind of natural disaster. So the first thing we see that we have to keep in consideration and consider is that this type of crisis creates despair, and is related to the rise of fascism, and in the recent years, the rise of the extreme right, and so the recent crisis of Brazil was particularly bad. So if growth doesn't happen in the next couple of years, as Paulo might talk to you about in his talk, and it's very unlikely that it will happen. This will be the worst decade in Brazilian history, in recorded Brazilian history. So the economic crisis is also caused by a variety of factors, and it was just bad luck that they happen all at the same time. So the prices of commodities, of Brazilian products that they sell abroad, fell a lot in 2014. And it's important to remember that during the Lula years, the golden years of Lulaism, exportation was really beneficial for Brazil and for its economy. The first term of Dilma Rousseff's presidency was really bad in terms of economics, and her plans didn't work out. The economists don't agree exactly on why things didn't work out, but there's a big discussion about how much this was responsible, how much this contributed to the economic crisis. During the impeachment, it was common to say that Dilma had caused that 8% fall in the gross domestic product, but nobody who on the right says this is not really possible. But the debate about how much responsibility she had, what role she had in the crisis, continues. It's 30%. There's some people estimate a little higher, a little lower, but there's no doubt that it was one of the factors, one of the important factors in causing the crisis. And the car wash operation. This is this investigation of corruption and bribery, and I'll talk a little bit about this later. But it's had short-term effects for those who live in Rio. It's very clear that when the accusations and came against the Petrobras, the national oil company, it was a big blow to that company and to their stocks. It's Petrobras. That company is integral to the car wash investigation, and it was essentially paralyzed by this investigation. And Petrobras is responsible for a large part of Brazilian investments, and so this stopped from night to day. And if in terms of the long-term effects, it's possible that this investigation will have good consequences. Because if we clean out and get rid of corruption, we'll have less money that's embezzled later on. But in short term, it's bad. And of course, the political crisis that made made it difficult to kind of deal with the other three crises. So we had essentially 4 years without an effective government that was able to deal with these problems. And all these things were going on, but there was nobody to respond to them. And this would have been a bad economic crisis regardless. But if it hadn't been during these 4 years, we had a president who was elected. If we had a president who was elected and who had stayed the 4 years, and the government had been functioning as it normally does, and if its institutions were more or less running as they should have, it's impossible to doubt that this would have been a less of a big deal, this economic crisis. Okay, so this car wash operation, this investigation, this image is for you guys to see kind of the complexity of what's going on. You can see the construction companies. You have politicians who are involved. You have those who are kind of the whistleblowers. So the size of this operation is impressive, and it's probably the largest corruption investigation of history in all the world. And I wouldn't call it a scandal, but it's the largest one that's happened, but the largest one that we know about. That's been actually denounced, and it's probable that in Russia there's been something worse. But when we compare this to Russian privatization, it's bad news. So, as you may know, the car wash operation discovered that there was a cartel of construction companies. That they were doing fraudulent invoices, and they would give money to politicians so that they would allow the cartel to continue to run. And all of the big parties were involved in this, and most of the political leaders in Brazil on all sides of the aisle were involved. And as a result, you arrive at this point where the Brazilian population doesn't know who to support. There's the Workers' Party was started, and then they fell with these charges, and then so they went to support the other party, but that was also accused, and so they're unsure who to trust and who to support. So there was a fall in the perceived legitimacy of political institutions in Brazil. So this graph shows how much people trust in political parties in Brazil, and the number of people that distrust political institutions has risen as a result of this investigation. And you see here the approval ratings for democracy in 2018, and this is the number of people who are satisfied with the state of democracy in Brazil. And so essentially we're below Venezuela, which is collapsing. And so that you guys can. As you can see, this is the election year, and you can see there's a lot of insatisfaction. Bolsonaro won this election in the year in which 9% of Brazilians approved or were happy with the way democracy was going in Brazil. So we've come now to what I think is a crucial misconception of public discourse about in Brazil today. If you talk to people, what most of them will say is that the economic crisis was caused by corruption, because the money ran out because the politicians stole it all, and it's really hard. There's a Data Popular poll that says that 67% of those who were interviewed said that the corruption was the main cause of the crisis, but this is not true. This is totally doesn't jive with the facts. And so if you look at the corruption scandals and the size and the amount of money that was embezzled, there are a few zeros. It's missing a few zeros in terms of the problems the bigger problems that Brazil is facing. All these questionable operations. So if corruption were eliminated entirely, then the economic crisis would be improved just a little bit, but not that much. but it's really important what the population thinks. So if you have a march of government workers in Rio, they said it's not a crisis, it's a question of robbery. They'd gone 6 months without being paid. The public funds had disappeared. People weren't being paid, and the press in Rio, they said that hundreds of millions of dollars were embezzled, and it's possible that this person thinks that they didn't get their salary because Sergio Cabral was taking the money. This is a very reasonable conclusion for them to make, but it's not true. It's false. So, if this is true, if my hypothesis is true, then this helps to explain Bolsonaro's election, because it says it means that the type of because economics was always a big question in terms of elections. If the economy is doing well, then the political party in power will have support, and if it's not, then they'll lose that support. But this year was an exception. Right? So the economy was really bad. People thought the left would win because of this, but it wasn't what happened. I think they didn't win because most people think that the economy is in bad shape because of corruption. They think the solution for this is not economic policy or reforms of structures. It's the prevalent opinion is that if they stopped bribing and accepting bribes, then money would come back. And this is very common. It's not something that you'll see just talking to people who are in groups of lower income, but it's judges, it's people that are higher in terms of socioeconomic status that'll say this as well. And this has become a trap for Bolsonaro, because he won, and now he has to make a bunch of reforms, a bunch of unpopular things, and the population didn't elect him for this. They elected him thinking that if he was honest, which he doesn't have, that he doesn't look like an honest person, but if he were honest, then the problems would disappear. You wouldn't have to make all these reforms to institutions, to economic policy, but in reality, he will have to. And the third factor that I think that contributed for Bolsonaro's election was that the impeachment killed the center right of Brazilian politics. If you ask political scientists in Brazil, a couple months before the impeachment, if Dilma was going to be impeached, they would have said no, she's not going to be impeached, because the center right isn't crazy. They wouldn't put Temer, the vice president, in power during this type of economic crisis. But whoever does this is going to lose the next election. They would be stupid to do this, so they're not going to take her out of power. But they did. So then what happened? I don't even know if you guys can see the popularity ratings of Temer. He's got 3% approval. It's the lowest, last year he did. It was the lowest popularity ratings in history, and and it's lower than the margin of error is 3%. So it's possible that he had 0% approval. So, as you know, the center-right party, the PSDB, after a couple of internal gaffes, they decided to support the impeachment, and so they put Temer in power. And you guys can see in the graph to the right that they did horribly in the last elections. It was a complete disaster in 2018. And so I want to tell you guys again, I was talking to Jean about this. I went to the Brazilian Association for Political Science last year, and it was 2 months before the election, and these two scholars, these two political scientists in Brazil, they thought that the PSDB would make it through the first round and go to the second round, that they would have a fighting chance. Because if you got some statistics of what happened last year, and there's the issues of economy, of course, which was going to be in the Labor Workers' Party, and then in terms of political alliances, and so everyone thought that's what would happen. But what Jairo Nicolau was saying is that are you sure this model's right forever? That these conditions in which these facts occurred haven't changed. That nothing has changed this year. And he was absolutely right. So as you can see on in the 2014, 2018 maps in terms of who voted for whom, you can see that Bolsonaro essentially stole all the votes of the center right in the first round of the election, and so he just about 1 week before the election he had about 30%, but then the last week he garnered so much more support that he almost won in the first round. And what's blue in the first map, always voted for the right. São Paulo was already essentially Bolsonaro's, and the left, they lost those states in which they had a fighting chance. And in Rio, the case of Rio was a little bit more complicated because Bolsonaro was there. So this graph shows, that the Workers' Party in the 2018 election, they were very strong, but very polarized. So if you look at the proportion of people who thought that Lula should be able to run and those who thought he shouldn't, it's 50-50. And this is a really important issue. You might say that that they decided not to vote for him, but in reality, Brazil was split down the middle on this issue. And so in when you have a two-stage election process, it's really hard to win like that. So if 50% of the population thinks that the candidate that you want to support should be in prison, then it's hard to win. But it's easy to make it past the first round and to make it to the second round. If 50% thinks that he should be elected. So, if you look at how Bolsonaro was able to take advantage of this environment, of these trends, how he was able to capitalize on this climate of dissatisfaction. So this Datafolha poll in October shows that, ask those who voted for Bolsonaro why they voted for him. And 30% wanted change. And the left has to think seriously about why in 2018 they were seen as the establishment. Right? Why people looked at the Labor Party candidates and said, this guy's involved in the car wash operation. Those are the guys who are, causing problems in the government, and I can't see these guys and these people making a positive change in the country. Anger against the Workers' Party was 25%, and these are the 25% who we're going to be on the right either way. That the left is never going to win over, and that's fine. And then here's another failure of the left, which is the fears about public safety. The left did not address this in their campaigns, and criticizing. They criticized the rights policies that has tons of problems, as many of you here as many scholars here will say, but they weren't able to tell the person who gets robbed, and the guy who was paying a loan on his cell phone. He'd just gotten a loan for it. He'd made one payment, and then it was robbed, and he has to keep paying. But the left wasn't able to explain to this man and these people how they would help him, and how he would have a more dignified life. So if people are getting robbed on the bus, then they want a solution now. And we also need to admit that the Workers' Party was not. It wasn't up to openly discussing its failures and its economic mismanagement, and the corruption inside it. And it's sad that they weren't able to do this. It's the excuses that were given were not convincing. And at the same time, the economic mismanagement in Dilma's government contributed to this dissatisfaction with the Workers' Party. If you're part of Dilma's party, you have to say, look, we're not going to do the same thing. We're going to change. We've learned from our mistakes. We're going to change policies. Especially, in light of the rights comments that the left had caused 100% of the economic crisis. In the second round, Fernando Haddad, the candidate who was running against Bolsonaro, essentially forgot about the Workers' Party, and he just kind of went off script and started talking about his own opinions, and so he if the Workers' Party had done more work in terms of coming to terms with its own problems in the past, it would have had a much better chance of defeating Bolsonaro. And for the first time, all the major evangelical churches supported the same candidate. This has never happened before. Usually they're split between, they vote for the more conservative parties in terms of the questions of morality and things like that. But the number of pastors and church leaders that voted for Lula was terrible. Excuse me. It was much better in the past, and in this most recent election, they all voted for the right. Because there were a lot of evangelical churches, and the vote is not always guaranteed that it'll go to the right. But in this case, it happened, and they have a very powerful machine. If you look at a kind of a demographic, the demographics of who voted for Bolsonaro, it was just shocking. I remember I was in Rio in the Quinta de Boa Vista. I was trying to talk to a group of evangelical women at a picnic, and a tough crowd, right? And what I heard essentially was that they believed these stories that the left is in favor of pedophiles, that they're going to force all children to become gay, and things like that. There was a really concerted effort on the right to spread these myths and spread these lies. So what do we do now? Bolsonaro government so far, I mean, the good news is that his government has been an incredible failure so far. He has very, very low approval ratings, the lowest at this point in his term of any Brazilian president. And there's windows in which nobody's criticizing him. Excuse me. There's been constant criticism of him. There's always something that he's doing wrong, he's saying wrong, and so people are constantly attacking him. There are conflicts between those who support the military and the populace, and the population has recognized this, and his popularity is falling. And so we can't guarantee that this is his approval ratings are going to stay low, and that he can't win the next election. So we need to he can learn from his mistakes. So we have a difficult dilemma. This is the big question for us. So on the one hand, do we need to increase militancy and protests against Bolsonaro, and in terms of defending the rights of women, gay, poor people. But on the other hand, we also need to create a coalition against Bolsonaro. We can't offend people who are kind of more in the center in terms of their politics, but who also don't like Bolsonaro. We can't antagonize them. So there are liberals that don't like him. There are people from the center that don't like him, and I think it would be a mistake for us to radicalize so much that we push those people away and classify them in the same category as fascists. And that's what I had to say. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking Jim Green for the invitation, and I'm going to speak in Portuguese, although the slides are in English, and this might cause some mental problems for you, some challenges. I also wanted to note that although I'm a government employee, everything that I say here is not an institutional opinion. This is a personal opinion. I'm not speaking for the government. This is all my personal views. So Celso's talk is going to allow me to skip a couple of things, and let me get his name out of here. But parts of our talks kind of overlap, and so I'm going to kind of skip through some of what I had prepared a little bit more quickly, so that I can get to my main point. So just to add to what he said, I think we can't forget 2013. 2013 is a crucial turning point in which protests, spontaneous protests that were usually the left had been engaging in. There was this question of the bus fare was raised 20 cents, and that that caused a lot of protests, and that changed the agenda for the paper because a reporter was attacked, and so then the newspaper that he belonged to kind of switched to supporting all of those protests, and so this was a big time of protests and public movement, and so when the press appropriates these kind of movements, they're going to learn how to move this forward more effectively. And other thing we can't forget about 2014 is the election in 2014. So for me, there's two characteristics that we need to highlight. So you can see the profound split. Celso showed this similar map already, and it was an election that was largely based on the idea of yes. It wasn't really a question of defending their own policies, but of destroying and attacking the other persons. There was this happened with Marina, another political candidate at that time, and so in 2014 there was the most important question of all is that the center-right party threw away the rule of the democratic system, which is that those who lose accept the outcome. So because this is essential to the democratic integrity of the country. Because if you lose, then you have the chance of winning next time, but you have to accept the democratically elected candidate. And the impeachment of Dilma started to undermine the democratic system, which precipitated an economic crisis. And because the government wasn't functioning fully, then we weren't able to address the economic crisis. There was no political vehicle to address the economic crisis, and so this was one of the causes I think that led to the big recession in the period, the 8% recession. In the 2016, we have Dilma's impeachment, and as I showed before, the right started making all of these protests, and because and people started giving money because these kind of protests cost money, and it was almost immediate that they were able to have 1 million people out on the streets in São Paulo almost immediately, and so this was a really important aspect of the time, and the conservative agenda started to take advantage of this movement and exercise violence against the left. There were various episodes, there were various physical aggressions against the left. And I'm going to tell a story about that happened to my own daughter. She was leaving a protest after the impeachment already. She was manifesting against Temer, and they started to kind of try and get away from the police. They threw a watermelon out of a apartment building onto the group that was below. So you see the outright hate, and luckily nobody was hurt. They were able to get out of the way, but that could have killed her. A mango out of an apartment window can cause a lot of damage. So imagine a watermelon. So in this period, we have this increase in violence and in hate, which is going to lead to 2018. So I also want to, have us consider a couple more elements. The most important causes for the political situation today in Brazil. So the car wash operation, which Celso talked about already, as one of the major issues. So the car wash operation, the feeling of a corrupt political system that we can't trust, that doesn't represent the will of the people, the public insecurity, neither the left nor the right was able to present a solution that people liked, the economic downturn and the anti-Workers' Party sentiment and the anti-Lula feelings. They are an integral part in this ascent, this rise of the right. There were 5 years in which every day people said the Workers' Party and the left is corrupt. The Workers' Party and the left is corrupt. 5 years on the TV and newspapers and the radio. Of course, this is going to affect people and have them have people want to get rid of the left. And then also the continuing consequences of the dictatorship in which the transitional justice measures were not taken, and so as a result, there's this kind of nostalgia for the golden years in which the military was in power and there was order and there was public security, this idealism that in the dictatorship everything was better, the economy was better, there was more public safety. None of this really came to the surface because of the lack of transitional justice measures. So one of the ideas of transitional justice is to prevent things from happening again. And so we are repeating history. This is showing us that the transitional justice measures that were not taken are causing the same problems to come up again. And so I think all of these are related in a second deeper layer of causes, which is structural racism and social prejudice. So our social structure, which is very, very layered, there's a lot of gaps between the different classes. There's not a lot of social mobility, and one class is violent against another class of people. There's no solidarity between people. There's a lot of solidarity among people of our own class. You're somebody like me. I'd give up everything for you. But if I'm talking about a different class, I'm very cruel. I don't like this difference. Brazil, which claims to be a plural society, is very, very biased in terms of class structure, classism, and racism and prejudice in terms of sexual orientation and gender and things like that. In 500 years of Brazilian history, 90% of this time we lived under authoritarian regimes, and so the exception has been the attempt to establish democratic state. It's of course all of the public institutions and private institutions, the civil society, the relationships are based on this authoritarian model, because that's the result of 500 years, almost 500 years of history. And so in this historically unequal and socially unequal state with absurd levels of inequality and state violence being sponsored, it was always a tool to guarantee and to preserve this inequality. The public security apparatus, which is inspired in these feelings that I'm talking about of anti-labor party and economic downturn and things like that, they result in essentially state violence being used to guarantee and to preserve the position of the elite. So they wanted to preserve their way of life. So they create these discourses about a war on drugs, which results in oppression of those who live on the periphery, minorities, and just reinforces all this social inequality. So how are people in the Maré Favela, the ghetto in Rio, how are they going to ascend socially if there are tanks rolling down the streets during throughout months and years of their life? It's disrupting the public life. So when you have this military presence, there's not the possibility of having public life. So the model is perfect, I think, for the elites and benefiting the elites. But I wanted to talk about democracy in Brazil. First, the lack of commitment that the elites have to preserve democracy. Democracy in Brazil works only if it doesn't threaten the privileges of the elite. This is what I call a democracy of convenience. In our history, every time that democracy was there was an attempt to establish democracy and in so doing was gonna threaten the privileges of the elite, then I drop democracy as a political project. In fact, I actively campaign against it if I'm a member of the elite. And so at the end of the Worker Party years, it was kind of this attitude, along with the end of the second slavery, which Elizabeth talked about. The relative gains in workers' rights. This was threatening the elite and preventing them from kind of maintaining the distance between other classes in Brazil. And it's 50% of people at the federal universities were now people who didn't share a racial background of the elite, and the airport became a very uncomfortable space because it now looks like a bus station because people who are poor are all of a sudden sitting next to me on the plane. And so, the idea of inequality and state violence used to maintain that equality is essential to what we need to understand to be able to move forward. And so when we talk about, when we go to look at another detail, which I think is, I think the statistics that Celso brought were very helpful. We need to understand that since the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, globalization has been kind of unchecked and has been growing, and this has increased inequality. The current capitalist model, which is based on money and is concentrated on the technological advances, has been instrumental in increasing inequality. I didn't have any statistics. I don't think we need to talk about this. I think you guys all know this. But there's extreme poverty perhaps because of these advances in capitalism. And whether they're governments of the right or the left, if they are not able to deal with this phenomenon, then they're not able to deal with this phenomenon. If you look at Argentina, they're unable to deal with an economic crisis there. There were people who, from one day to the next were in a position of privilege, and then all of a sudden with an economic downturn, they were treated as dirt. And because of this focus on money and the, Fernando Henrique, the Brazilian president's administration, there was a lot of speculation and a lot of inflation and unsafe growth of the capitalist system. And so states are held hostage by big corporations and financial institutions. And so, but in the citizen, the average citizen's mind, it's not capitalism that's failing, it's democracy. So the association of my position of inequality and poverty, I'm thinking, democracy, it's not working. And so that opens the door for populism, whether it's from the left or from the right. I think, populism of the right capitalizes on hate and on this angst. But either way, opening the door to that is dangerous, whether it's from the left or the right. It's a very subtle process, but the capitalist, capital doesn't allow the state to be strong, but the blame for those consequences goes on the state. And so pay attention to how the discussion is not where it should be. That the deepest causes, the most profound causes of these problems are capitalism, but they're not being addressed. And now we want to talk about the alliances, the coalitions that Bolsonaro has created. The conservatives in the military and the police forces that defend kind of these harsh, repressive public security programs, and have this kind of, they support this idea of kind of controlling the state in an authoritarian way to defend their ideas. We have the evangelical churches who are talking about education needing to be based on God. We have to talk about creationism, and we've kind of gone back to this pre-Enlightenment stage. And churches have been very effective in this. Now, also the interests of, and this is also related to the idea that the economy has no commitment, has no compunctions about who it serves. The population of people are pushed to be anti-Workers' Party, anti-Lula, and the fake news is kind of allowing you to hear what you already think, hear what you already agree with, and causes these kinds of problems. And allows people to think, for example, that the Workers' Party is in support of pedophiles. This wave of violence is spiraling out of control. It's becoming more and more political. So the Katende episode, though, that of Marielle, there was, last week or the week before, there was 80 shots fired, and there's an operation last week of kind of repressing and violence to kind of ostensibly get rid of the problems in an area, but really we're an excuse to exercise violence. So I'm going to kind of sum up here a little bit. I was going to mention a couple of measures that the government has adopted in their first 100 days that prove that what they were saying wasn't just rhetoric, that they were actually trying to deliver on what they promised during the campaign. Controlling NGO activities, withdrawing from the UN Global Compact for migration, shutting down land reform, making it easier to purchase weapons, and controlling the access to information, draft of a law that I called the Slaughter Act, which allows security forces to execute suspects before, to prevent being hurt themselves. And Rio has been the death rate is 9 for every 100,000 people, and so it's not just violence, but it's actually violence that's exercised by the police. The paralyzation of public participation in the government, and losses in terms of prohibiting torture, the announcement of the Brazilian embassy in Jerusalem, that the offer to the U.S. to build a military base in Brazil, and things like that. So let's focus on on understanding. I'm almost to the end of my talk, but the 100 days of misgovernment that we've been living through. So what we see is this internal fight between these four groups, disputing for control and for the control of the agenda. And although those who look the most sophisticated, it might be surprising, but are actually the military officers. They've kind of been the moderating forces in these discussions, and I would say that an important characteristic that we continue to see is the attempt to undermine kind of the popular conception of the government, to destabilize political parties, and to subscribe to this Trumpian idea that that we can just go directly to the people through social media, and we don't need to go through the media, big media news outlets. So the government is declining and losing popularity, and so then that makes me wonder, well, what about the other powers? How have they been reacting to this? And I've been surprised till now positively with the Congress, and they have played a stabilizing role and have kind of controlled and cut back Bolsonaro's attempts to pass these reforms and these laws. We don't know exactly how this is happening. I don't know exactly who's wielding power in these relationships, but they have been actually able to kind of rein in Bolsonaro. What about the Supreme Court, the judiciary? The judiciary has doing the exact opposite. They have been attacked by the virtual militia, and those who are supporting the car wash operation and the groups of the far right. They react. The judiciary has reacted in a way that's incomprehensible. They started an investigation that has said that censorship, that supports censorship, that supports concentrating powers, and the court can now decide that it's a victim, investigator, prosecutor, and judge all in one. So the foundation of the judiciary is now controlled by the far right. So now we start to get worried, right? And now I'm looking at Those who are younger might not recognize this, but yeah, this is the old shoe phone from Get Smart. And there's also an episode when there's a prepaid shoe phone, and he has to put put coins in the phone for it to work. I'll talk about that a little bit later, maybe. But our feeling is that we live in this chaotic moment, this chaos, this organization, this secret organization would be undermining all of the traditional models of living and of politics. So the question is, what will come next? What is our crystal ball telling us? Okay, there's a lot of factors that the answer depends on. So whether the opponent forces will find a balance and which of them will win out, how and when the opposition in the parliament will be able to make an organized stand, if the government is strong enough to keep pushing other powers, if they're pushing back and resisting the other powers and the internal disputes. The outcomes of the investigation into Marielle's assassination and the militia, and I think this is a really important aspect to highlight. You know, the outcome of this investigation and the investigation between the president's sons and the militia. How the social movements will organize the struggle for rights and democracy. And I think there's also a question of our changing the narrative. We need to change the narrative. We've bought into the narrative of the right in many ways, and we have to change that narrative and create a narrative from the left to understand what's happening. So I see a lot of different possibilities that could come. One is that we are able to balance the kind of the interplay between these various forces and allow Jair Bolsonaro to complete his 4 years of term, which would actually support the left's argument and defense of democracy. We could have this lasting chaos, or we could have the right solution, which is the military forces kind of winning out, or that they end the democratic process and elect a general as a vice president, essentially. Or another possibility is the return of old discourses about opportunist parliamentarism. And so the future is very unstable and open. We don't know exactly where we're going to end up. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for all of you for your 3 talks. Very rich. I have a lot of notes and questions, but I'll be very brief so I can hand it to the audience. I'll make 3 questions directed to the talks in order, but you can all answer as you please. So first, vou começar com o inglês e passo para o português. Elizabeth, eu queria ouvir de você sobre o que na sua pesquisa pode generar mais abordagens comparativas sobre o que você falou, o que é uma das questões em aberto que não apareceu, é a importação de guerras culturais, né? O que você vê como os potenciais limites de familiaridades táticas para aqueles que seguem as políticas americanas no Brasil? Existe uma correlação entre as questões raciais nos Estados Unidos e Brasil?
Not just in this cycle, but even in the previous presidential cycle. So that's the question. And I think for somebody who works on cities like myself, a starting point is always the extent to which spatial segregation works very differently here in Brazil and the U.S. Right? In Brazil, very dramatic among the rich. If you look at racial dot maps of Leblon, it's basically just white people, but not in lower income neighborhoods, very different from the US. And so I would love to hear your insights on that. One of the discourses, and this connects to something Marlon was saying, that struck me from one of your images was the language of novas oportunidades in making a pitch for the reformas trabalhistas. And we see this again with the Reforma da Previdência, and it's sort of this appeal to entrepreneurship that in Brazil's case the right has been very effective at, and the left has been very reluctant to play ball with. And this is a critique Tatiana Rocha in Brazil has articulated, I think, persuasively. So, Celso, my question is about your dilemma. Até que ponto dá para fazer os dois ao mesmo tempo? Ocupar o centro, formar novas coalizões mais amplas e militância de esquerda, enfim, e resistência ao bolsonarismo. E quais seriam as pautas capazes de gerar essas novas coalizões? Descriminalização, etc. Então, partindo um pouco do contexto de uma tempestade perfeita, de alianças heterogêneas, instáveis, etc., as novas oportunidades que seriam capazes de desfazê-las. E muitas das quais muito familiares para quem conhece os Estados Unidos, né? Mercado financeiro, grupos neopentecostais, etc. Então é isso, né? Dá para respondermos all of the above, né? Para esse dilema. E Marlon me convence em absoluto a sua análise dos pontos de inflexão, desde da atuação do PT contra a Marina, Aécio não aceitando resultado, direito se apropriando do espaço público, mas até certo ponto são todos fenômenos familiares, se não no Brasil, enfim, numa perspectiva mais global, né? Quer dizer, nada aí é necessariamente novo. Mas eu acho que tem uma variável que é relativamente nova e que nós ainda não temos como entender com precisão, inclusive a escala é difícil de precisar, que é o ponto de inflexão tecnológico. Você termina com memes, mas enfim, nós sabemos que esse foi uma das variáveis na ascensão do Bolsonaro no último ciclo eleitoral. E a minha pergunta é até que ponto nós estamos, ou os riscos de subestimar as redes, não só como vetor de radicalização, quer dizer, esses 25% que não tem jogo, os conservadores, são os mesmos de 20 anos atrás, ou são diferentes porque foram radicalizados por discursos sobre, enfim, mamadeira, né, sobre esquerda com pedófilo, etc, etc. Infelizmente, nós não temos dados bons o suficiente. Mas, então, a rede não só como vetor de radicalização, mas como espaço de formação de novos sujeitos políticos, de uma direita que nós não temos como entender bem ainda e que, de forma muito orquestrada, porque faz a gente rir de mamadeira, rir meio que das notícias, etc., mas, enfim, ontem mesmo já aparecem ali memes prontos sobre ineficiências dos Correios, com a mesma linguagem, pessoas reproduzindo.
So we know that there are certain interests that are sort of creating this whole narrative, this new aesthetic. So everything is pointing towards this new strategy and interests, the interest of the capital, using this new media to play individuals against the state, right? It hasn't to do with capitalism, it has to do with the state. It's easier to think about the administration as culpable, which is also it's similar to the North American politics, but the versions are unknown and we need to understand what's up. So those are my questions. Então acho que eu vou começar com a minha resposta. Muito obrigada pela sua pergunta. Então, em muitas formas, a sua pergunta chega a uma coisa que eu estava intencionalmente evitando, que é fazer essas comparações.
What I think is actually pretty relevant now in terms of our political leadership and also mobilization around issues related to inequality. And so the question that you asked was specifically about culture wars and what that might look like. In your comparison point, you mentioned this briefly. You said it would look differently in part because of the level of segregation in the United States and what that might mean. And I think that this is really an interesting question. And so I want to respond to this based on what I've been hearing online. I've really been taking more seriously these kind of online sites and these places where folks who typically aren't included in research are articulating their ideas. And what we find, one of the things I was talking about is the power of these online interfaces to be a space where folks can debate issues. But one of the difficulties that Black Brazilians are talking about in particular is what it means to be part of these broader circles that are racially diverse, because being anti-racist is being interpreted as being anti-white, right? And in a way, in some ways, because of the ways that peer groups and friendship groups work in the United States, if that were the response of white folks in the United States, that would actually have a lower impact on people of color because of how friendship circles function. But because friendship circles are more interracial in Brazil, there's this interesting hesitation on some people's part to participate in anti-racist, for example, movements out of fear of being cast as being anti-white. So that's an interesting debate. But even beyond that, the comparisons, you asked, to what extent might it be fair to make comparisons between the culture wars that we see in the United States and the culture wars that we see in Brazil? I think we have to be really careful about that. I think it's reasonable to be able to talk about similarities, but I certainly wouldn't go to the extent of suggesting that they are identical, because there's so many different nuances that I think make them distinctive. I think that Brazil's history of the dictatorship, I think that the fact that even discourses around inequality are still relatively new. I think, as you mentioned, the sense that folks have freedom to debate issues in a different way. I think all of those things play a part in the ways that young people in particular are engaging in these ideas and what these culture wars, if we call them that, look like on the ground. I don't know if I would actually call them culture wars. There's a whole debate to be had about what that even means and how that ends up being mobilized to discourage conversations of difference. But that's a different conversation. So thank you for your question.
Todo mundo ouvindo? Bom, até que ponto, aquilo que eu disse, né? A gente tem que considerar.
We have to kind of reconcile militants' activism with the possibility of relating to the center, right, so that we can have kind of the broadest reach possible in defending democracy. So it's very hard to do this. I'm not underestimating the difficulty of doing this, but it's necessary. So the first thing we have to do is to accept that in the fight for democracy, there's going to be people who have very, very different opinions. And I think that it's necessary for us to know how to focus our energies on fighting the other side, who are the real threat to democracy. So there's, we can't expect for people to have the same opinions about Bolsonaro, somebody who's from the landless workers movement compared to somebody from the middle class. There's going to be a lot of variation in what they think, and that's fine. We have to learn to live with this. But one thing that creates difficulties in this process is that a lot of people from the center right, that are kind of opposing Bolsonaro from their field, they're saying that the radicalization that he is defending is just as bad as that happens on the left, and so that's a shame. But I don't think it's it's something that we can't overcome. We need to be able to talk to these people still. An important part of the process will be the center right kind of regaining its power in its own field. And so I think it's that our focus should not be attacking that. We don't have to accept everything they say, we have the right to disagree, but I think that it's necessary for us to kind of control the tone of these conversations and the intensity of the discussions, the debates that we have, the fights even with those who are different from us within the democratic field, and because it's only in that way that we'll be able to preserve democracy. So we have to have a lot of goodwill for those who kind of give up their support of Bolsonaro. And we've seen a little bit of this. We've seen the left kind of rejecting these people and saying, no, you chose Bolsonaro and you can't take that back. No, we need to reach out to these people and kind of regain their support and friendship. And so those who support Bolsonaro and then decide not to, they're people that we can talk with. Of course, we're going to have disagreements because they voted for Bolsonaro for some reason, but we need to be able to talk to them and do that in a civil manner. And if not, then these people will continue to talk bad about the left, and we need to try and reconcile that and learn to live with it. There's going to be a lot of discord within this movement to defend democracy, which happened in the last dictatorship. There was a lot of discussion within the opposition, and so we'll have to kind of develop strategies to maintain a dialogue with people that are very different. And there's going to be a lot of debates, discussions, fights. I mean, already within the left there are fights every day. So of course there are going to be fights if we kind of expand the group to include the center right. Bruno, thanks very much for your question. Can you hear me? It's very interesting that there are people that compare, the question of the social media and technology, and say, we've already gone through this with radio and television. There's already been technological advances, but I see a difference this time because the advances in the past worked with the idea that there was somebody on the other side that you were talking to. And now social media, the difference is that there is no intermediary figure. Right? We think about four main news networks from North America control essentially all social media in the world. Then it's a very different question. And so, for good or for ill, then the people can manipulate this control, and people think the internet gives them the liberty to say whatever they want with no consequences, and to be questioned less. Which before using the radio and television, there was a little bit more willingness to listen, and so we kind of miss those old attitudes by editors, by writers, because at least they had, of course there were exceptions, but for the most part, and also talking about what was called the brown press, those were from the minorities, but in any case, there was not as much of the discourse of hate. And now this is everywhere. It's multiplying exponentially with the tools that people have access to now, and expressing their political mentality in that way. And so I see this blindness and this lack of objectivity. And people think it's fun. We're gonna destroy the state, and but nothing. But it might turn back on them. It might backfire on them, and so people using social media can use social media to oppose various groups and to criticize the people that are in power now, and so the center right, as they were supporting the impeachment, they were essentially giving themselves the death sentence, but they didn't realize that. And people were thinking that Bolsonaro was going to have a liberal agenda. How in the world did they think that? Come on. So there's so much blindness. So it's not just a desire to make money on the in the short term. You know, people want to get bonuses, and it's not just. Well, I guess people are focused on the short term. You know, they're not concerned with a long term future of corporations, of governments. They're just focused on the now, of making money now, which is happening in Europe as well, although not quite as quickly. So, without a doubt, we have to understand this. This process is happening. We have a lot of difficulty in interpreting what's going on because it's very nuanced. But for sure, this phenomenon is these bubbles. What I think is that we have to start working on, and I think it's something for the judiciary. We have to work on the responsibility and accountability of these platforms, because they have to be held accountable. This capacity to be able to, in an instant, be influencing millions of people, tens of millions of people the world over, they need to be held accountable for what they're doing, because they're the vehicles for all these kinds of messages. And so we need to bring these topics up in the political arena, and they are not just means of communication; they're means of communicating points of view and messages that will support the states that are in power right now and the groups that are in power. And so this is a big challenge, but it's a necessary path that we tread. And maybe one of the possible agendas for those who are trying to defend democracy.
So I've seen a bunch of hands up already. Let's do questions 3 by 3. So let's start over there. Marcia. And then, thank you. All right, gonna. Congratulations, Celso. Congratulations, Elizabeth. Congratulations, Marlon. Sorry. Yeah. Congratulations for your talks. I'm going to be very objective in my questions. Elizabeth, I want to know if in your research you observed different levels of assimilation to the família de criação based on the color of the skin of the filhas de criação. I ask this because I come from a class where girls were adopted, and I noticed that the lighter-skinned girls were adopted and more embraced by the families. And when the darker-skinned girls were adopted, they ended up being not as embraced by the families. I want to see if you noticed any of that. Celso, you talked about corruption being utilized as something that would explain the downfall of the system. So you cited the question of Cabral. I ask because I'm from a party that manipulated that discourse a lot against my will. But I wanted to ask about the role of this left parties. And already with Marlon, I want to ask both of you this question of saying the left without observing the plurality of the left itself. Celso, how can Bolsonaro bank in the will to change for the population if it's been in power for 30 years? And what is the criticism that the press can make out of their role in this, out of the role in creating an anti-petismo, anti-workers' party? So what is the self-criticism the press has to do about itself, since it's always asking for self-criticism of the left? And the Marlon, Eduardo Cunha as a figure of the lower clergy, right, and the rising of the lower clergy. What's the role of the lower clergy in this, the economic failure of Dilma? And lastly, why did both of you ignore Lula's arrest in your talk. What is the role of Lula's arrest in this scenario? And talking about Lula's arrest and the anti-Republican behavior of the judicial system, why did the Supreme Court completely ignore the massive campaign of fake news through social media? Completely ignored, allowing it to negatively impact the elections, allowing for Bolsonaro to win, and now behaving like this overreaction and censoring social media for criticisms against the Supreme Court itself. Well, morning, thank you. It was a pleasure to hear all of you. Very elucidating. My question is about the question of the left. I'm glad Jean already brought this issue up. From my point of view, and I agree with what we said yesterday, with what Jean said yesterday. In fact, we need to broaden our field, our structure, our dialogue in the name of democracy. And we need to self-criticize the left, right? Unfortunately, we talk a lot about the self-criticism of the Labour Party, but I think it's interesting that we talk about the self-criticism of the whole left. When we talk about feminism, we talk about feminisms, so we should be talking about lefts. The Brazilian left is very fragmented. I'm going to talk about on the point of view of the testimony, my own experience, because I think it talks about something. So I was part of a party, of the Socialist Liberty Party for a long time, and I had to move into the workers, the Labor Party, when I moved to Rio. So I know a lot of that party, and I am very clear in saying that it is a very moralist party in the worst sense, just like the Workers' Party, with the aggravating fact that it's against the Labor's parties. Marielle was the only person who ever asked me why I left the Labor's Party, right? And I said that it's because it's a party of white men, of old colonels. And Jean was not one of these men. Marielle knew of that. Marielle was very betrayed inside the party, and the operations, the power play inside the Social and Liberty Party is cruel. In the Labor's Party, I went as a very renowned person. I was a victim of attacks from the extreme right, but also from the Social and Liberty Party. There was a huge campaign against me. Today, I ask for a self-criticism of the Social and Liberty Party because my relationship with them is not personal. I do not friends of them with them, but I will still support them for governments because they're still on the left, and I'm trying for the unity of the left. I only became a candidate for the government of Rio because PSOL rejected the support of the Workers' Party. So it's a party that still lives from the old power place, right? Why am I talking about PSOL? Because all the other parties, PCdoB, the Communist Party, the Workers and Unity Party, they're all the same, right? The Labour Party is gigantic. I left the PSOL for the PT beyond because I didn't want to support people who defend the car wash. I wanted a left that is looking for results. So I just wanted to share this with you because I'm looking to think about this moralist trap that the left falls into, right? Because the Labour Party is one of the less corrupt parties. It's not the most corrupt party. And I think we need to talk about that because we need to unite our left and the democracy, those who fight for democracy, and unite with the center right, if it's the case, but to try to rescue our country. Sorry about my access, but thank you. And then you do all the questions. I particularly would like to declare that I would like self-criticism of the left pact. Eu tinha uma pergunta para você, professora Hordge-Freeman. Eu sei que você tem um pé atrás em fazer essas comparações internacionais, mas para mim foi muito bom ouvir sobre as filhas de criação e por isso dentro de uma narrativa internacional maior de militância de mulheres.
In the United States, stretching to Argentina, to Spain, and all parts of the world, and now the teacher strikes that you're seeing here, but also in Poland, as an attack on neoliberalism's attack on care and the strain that it's putting on that. And my question for you is, as someone who's interested in social reproduction theory and Marxist feminism, a charge I often hear from maybe more orthodox Marxists is, we need to be focusing on the pressure points of capital, on where surplus value is extracted in the productivist sector. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the limitations, but also the opportunities of organizing around the sphere of care, specifically in Brazil.
So to answer the first question, so thank you for your question about filhas de criação, and essentially, can you all hear me okay? Hello? Okay. So essentially your question was, to what extent does race shape how well incorporated a filha de criação can be in their family? And that's an interesting question because overwhelmingly the women in my study are identified as pardos, pardas and pretas. But there were two women who identify as white, and it was interesting to hear them talk about their experiences because what the first one said is she actually mentioned, she said it was actually easier to hide her because she was white and she looked like her family. But that didn't mean that they treated her better. So she said when they went out, it was just easier. People never questioned. So if she was, let's say, hit in public, nobody was thinking that she was a filha de criação. So it was easier for her to hide and easier to be exploited because of that. The other thing is that visibility. So being black in a white family, for example, made the white wealthier families really cognizant of how they presented the black child. So some of the respondents talked about how their families would dress them up a little bit better when they went out, just to avoid any assumption that they were being mistreated. So the visibility of having a black filha de criação was important. Other ways that this mattered was that there were actually different expectations. So again, the white filhas de criação were actually the ones to point this out. And I was actually surprised by this. They would talk about how their responsibilities were different, and they assumed it was because they were white. So they would compare themselves to the other filhas de criação in these families. So something that people don't realize is that oftentimes these families have more than one filha de criação in the family. So they have agregadas. So that oftentimes there's several people. And so many of them talked about the relationship that they had to the others and were able to comment on that. Okay. I'm going to answer this last question, and then I probably should head out because I can hear the baby crying. Your question was about global care work, and I really appreciate your question. And so last year I was actually, so in this presentation I was wary about making the comparisons, but I think as it relates to care work, I think that this is really important. In fact, a couple of years ago I presented on a global care work conference that was really about these questions of leveraging what's happening at an international level to be able to address these concerns. But I also like the second part of your question, which is about the limitations of organizing around these spheres of care. Because what's interesting about this is that these conversations are still multi-level. So you have women who might be organizing around spheres of care, but yet they're still depending on the care work of women of color, even while they're organizing around spheres of care. So you have these contradictions that many times these women aren't necessarily willing to confront in their struggles. And so one of the limitations that I immediately see is that one. But beyond that, I think that it is important, particularly in Brazil, to question this area of care work because it has been so racialized and gendered, and because we see the same types of ideological commitments about, or ideological positions as it relates to who should be doing the care work. And we see that extended into people's treatment in other sectors of society, particularly as it relates to Black women. So the inability to see Black women beyond the work the care that they give to other folks is an important issue to be addressed. So in that sense, I think that it's important. But I think that when we think about care work on the global scale, there's several different questions that would make me hesitant to support some aspects of what we're seeing in terms of mobilizing around spheres of care work, if that makes sense. So it makes sense in some ways, but in other ways it can end up reifying inequalities if the folks involved aren't willing to confront their own privileges while they organize. If that makes sense. Excuse me.
Maybe.
Bom, eu acho que dá para agrupar as perguntas em duas grandes questões. A primeira é a pluralidade da esquerda, a esquerda tem, e a necessidade de autocrítica.
And the necessity for the left to criticize themselves, and the question of the car wash operation. So the Brazilian left is very diverse. There are different parties. Different parties in the left have different problems. So I've already been accused of not encouraging the left to criticize itself, and this is a personal problem. So I'm a member of the Workers' Party for a long time, and I feel responsibility to improve that party. I would never want to do that for the right. I do not accept this work of helping the right question itself. I don't want to civilize Bolsonaro. So fine, go look for somebody who's more competent than I am to do that, but I would never do that. And the other thing I think is the question of self-criticism is that it's not to do. It's not something we should do to try to appease and please people outside. It's something we should do to help the left work better, to function better. And so if we criticize ourselves about the corruption of the Workers' Party, we can ask ourselves, the way in which coalitions were made, and I'm certain that it was necessary to make these coalitions, to do these alliances, but with the Petrobras, with other parties, and everyone knew this was going on. And I think we need to do this not to satisfy the people on the right, because they're never going to be satisfied with the way we operate, but we need to do this so that in the next election. We can improve the government and the Petrobras. We need to always realize that the scandals of Petrobras, they made life difficult for those who are defending Petrobras, and for those who are defending state-run companies. The left basically, when they let people kind of take everything from Petrobras, they were kind of shooting themselves in the foot. Right? The Petrobras has played an important role in the left's discourse. So it's obvious that the Workers' Party is not the only one responsible for corruption in Brazil, but there's an urgent need for self-criticism. I'm not the only one who's going to be able to facilitate this. I don't know everything that needs to be done. So when I think about reorganizing the Workers' Party, I talk about that because I know that party and I know it's possible to reorganize, but I don't think the same thing about the other left parties, right parties, excuse me, and so I don't see this as my task, as my job. So okay, car wash operation. It's a controversial question, but if on the one hand you actually are unable to talk about corruption and the problem, and you're unable to kind of focus exclusively on corruption as happened in the last election, what might happen is that if you talk about Marina's party, the kind of environmentalist party, the Green Party, this kind of discourses would probably lead the party to dissolve ideologically and politically. That kind of discourse and self-analysis didn't stick, and she was not supported. Marina wasn't. So on the other hand, we also have to, if we go to the election and the only thing that we have to say about corruption, is that the car wash people, they committed abuses of power, and they did. But if that's the only thing we say, and that we only say that the judiciary stepped beyond its bounds, which they did, we're always going to lose. What we can say is that those who are corrupt need to go to prison. We need to admit that there were people in our parties that committed abuses and that need to go to prison. We need to distance ourselves from those kinds of people. Some people, we can't prove what they did, but they've been denounced, and some people are in jail without there having been proof of anything, and that's a problem, and people need to be tried fairly. But on the other hand, there are people that we have proof that they were corrupt and that they did illegal things, and so they need to be held responsible for those things. When the treasurer went to prison, the Congress was kind of singing his name and calling him the defender of the people. And so, if we campaign with people in our party who are corrupt, it's going to be a hard battle for us. So, if we're sending those kind of people to the front, without their being able to say they're honest, without their being able to say they're not corrupt, then that's a problem. It's a huge mistake. So we can't, get rid of the discourse about corruption. Can't be the only item on our agenda, but we also needed to denounce the abuses of power and embezzlement. The car wash operation has been going poorly. The judges and the investigators have begun politicizing this investigation, and that's a problem because they're clearly swimming in deep waters, and so the kind of their proximity to Bolsonaro has been a disaster for them, for those who are fighting corruption in Brazil. Areas who are really excited about the car wash operation are now distancing themselves because they don't want to be next to Bolsonaro. They want to be in proximity with him. And everybody knows that those who support Bolsonaro and the car wash are opportunist people. Right? They're trying to get rid of the political class in Brazil, and which, from Bolsonaro's perspective, is great because they don't want people who are from the establishment in power. And so I think we need to know how to kind of balance and kind of navigate between these two extremes. We need to not use anti-corruption as our only agenda item, but we also need to address it. We need to come to terms with how much money was embezzled and stolen by politicians. But because if we only say that the judiciary overstepped its bounds in the investigation, then we're not going to convince anyone. I'm going to try and be very objective. When I talk about the left, I'm talking about the category, right? Just like when I talk about the elite of Brazil, and so there's which consists of a category and subcategories. So I recognize that there's a lot of variety and difference among the left, but it's just a rhetorical term that we use to be able to give a presentation in 20 minutes and kind of communicate our main arguments. And so we recognize that these are not monolithic categories, that there's a lot of variety, but in 20 minutes we have to kind of sum things up. This is a macro analysis. We're looking at things at a very surface level because we're trying to, my analysis was just to try and create a context for people to, to kind of take advantage of David Bowie's crystal ball to predict the future. And so forgive me for kind of using simplistic terminology. So Lula, I didn't talk about that, or the stabbing of Bolsonaro. I think those are two essential aspects of the narrative, but it was just in the interest of time that I cut those two slides because if I could have inserted them, but both episodes are fundamental for explaining the results that we have now. I think you're right. The criticism is relevant. It was just a question of time. Eduardo Cunha, he represents not only the low clergy, but also the ascension, the rise of the organized crime. And Severino Cavalcanti is one example. So I'm unable to look at Bolsonaro without remembering Severino Cavalcanti. And so that's another problem we have to deal with. So he is more than just the low clergy. He was the synthesis of how Dilma was on the ropes, and how the Workers' Party was unable to kind of navigate that political situation, and they were kind of in an unsustainable situation. It was unsustainable, his candidacy in that moment, because if it was on this path. And so seeing the disaster of Eduardo Cunha, maybe you could explain this better than I could, but we are just shocked at what happened. Yeah, but that's what I mentioned before. So to explain the economic crisis, it's related to the blockade that the center-right. It's funny because the center-right, the PSDB, they always said that the Workers' Party tried to blockade and tried to block any movement, any reforms proposed by the PSDB. But then they did the exact same thing. They blocked any reaction to the economic crisis on the part of the PT. And so the crisis for me was a lot more political than economic, because we could have had the political means to respond to it, and we had the intelligence to do it, but because of politics, because of kind of arguments between different parties, this was blocked and impeded, and has led Brazil to where it is today. And so this is very interesting because it's been 5 years since the second election, and there's not even discussion in the press about the neoliberal model. It's all, nobody's talking about the neoliberal model that was implemented in 2015 and on forward has only generated more poverty and difficulty and oppression. It's crazy. The discussion is really just off in terms of where it's focusing and in terms of our ability to solve these problems. So it looks like I haven't seen any commentator in any article in 5 years, 5 years since this the second term of Dilma. There's been no criticism of this system. I'm also not able to read everything, so it's possible that I missed something. Okay, well, I used to. Okay, so it sounds like there's one in this newspaper, Carta Capital. I used to subscribe to it, but I don't read it anymore, just because it became a little bit too polarized for me, because I lost trust in it. And after the electoral campaign, I subscribed to the Folha journal again so that I could read Celso and others. It wasn't out of conviction that that it was always right, but just out of solidarity. And the question of the judiciary and fake news, I can't give you an answer on that. This is a really open question. My reading of it, my very superficial reading of it, and maybe it's a little bit too simplistic, but and I might change my mind 5 minutes from now, but I think that what Alexandre de Moraes saw is that they assumed that they were the best ones to answer the questions because they had all the power concentrated in their hands. And so there was, we need a lot more intelligence, we need a lot more careful observation to be able to solve these kind of problems. We're not going to be able to solve this problem overnight. I'm going to stop there.
So I think we have time for 2 more questions. Objective questions. And please, let's speak slowly, in order not to wake up Janelle. Well, my name is Cauê, and I'm from Unesp, State Universidade de São Paulo, State University in São Paulo. And I'm here in the Africana Studies Department as part of my doctorate. This is more of a commentary, dialoguing with the table in a general way. What seems to me is that there is in Brazil a perverse confluence between a certain whiteness metaphysics and the emergency of authoritarian people in Brazil. I don't approximate myself from fascism because I don't know, I don't have knowledge of the concept. It's curious because the moment of the emergency of an authoritarian speech also conflates with the cassation, with the persecution of affirmative action that the PSL, Bolsonaro's party, has implemented. So where they go to the Supreme Court, the sort of judicial actions, a series of progressive judicial actions that have made affirmative action possible are being attacked. So we as black intellectuals and militants, we look into this progressist element. But this element also comes a white lash that started in 2008 with this telling of the right that the affirmative action is unconstitutional. In order to talk about the metaphysics of whiteness and authoritarian personalities, in 1980, Folha did a research, did a poll about self-identified declarations of race, where we had 136 callers. What is interesting, that whiteness surpasses this research as an element. So today we have a construction of black identities that are more positive in Brazil. But this whiteness, this latent whiteness, is no less eminent in the construction of politics solidarity. So for instance, with the question of Bolsa Familia, the face of Bolsa Familia is black. It's a it's a black woman. And black people in Brazil, they suffer from their visibility. So walking in the street, a black man represents a perceived homogeneity. So what they're doing is that through this racialized images, they're trying to play into this shaky subjectivity. So this way we are allowed to understand how Bolsonaro's whiteness is the main way for him to create political affections and solidarities until he appears with a black man. Right? We are, the moment he appears with a black man on stage, we are able to see how his whiteness is one of his main articulating features. And I conclude by talking about how Brazil is it's a colonial country, and its colonial past. We live in a racial capitalist country, as Du Bois would say. What I want to say with that is that our normative markers, our identity markers, are surpassed by race. They're shaped by race. Everything is racialized, and here's not necessarily the color of your skin. So when there's a dispute for Brazil's regulation, it's also a dispute it's also a dispute of race regulation and gender regulation, because there's no race without gender. So racism is not a found element in a colonial society. It's everywhere. Morning to all, and thank you for the table for your reflections. I'd like to ask Celso and Marlo a question. But before, just a brief comment, because this past week, João Moreira Salles has published a text in Piauí, remembering one of the more preserved stories in Brazil, the case of Francenildo. And there's two historic facts in the history of the Workers' Party. First is this case, and then the second is the question of Belo Monte, which I've been keeping up with by what Eliane Brum has been writing. And this is the way that the left, let's forget about the right, it brings up the question of to what extent is the left in Brazil democratic? And this is the fundamental question right now, because since we're building a coalition, we need to think about this in democratic. And here I'm asking Jean, forgive me, I'm talking about esquerda as a superficial category. In the case of Tabata Amaral, who did a great speech against the Ministry of Education, was immediately attacked by a lot of people in the left and in the Workers' Party, saying, no, this girl comes from the empresarial sector, it comes from private sector. So to what extent are we really democratic? And now, Celso, you talked about the necessity of building this general left front. One of the things that left to the center-right to migrate to Bolsonaro was an incapacity of the left to talk about the public bills, the public budget and economy. There wasn't transparency. So I remember you saying, like, Haddad was not crazy about saying we didn't need a social security reform. Like, we need a social security reform, and at one point we're going to have to talk about this. So my question is, do we talk about this in the left today, within the Workers' Party, or economics talking about this? Então, isso aqui é mais um comentário. Eu queria responder a sua pergunta. Obrigada. Eu vou tentar falar mais alto. Vocês conseguem me ouvir? Eu queria responder brevemente ao seu comentário. Não foi uma pergunta, foi mais um comentário. Então, eu acho que sobre a metafísica da branquitude. E eu realmente gosto da ideia do que você fala sobre...
I think what's important about that, particularly as it relates to filhas de criação, is this idea that Brazil's colonial legacy, its legacy of being a slaveocracy, is absolutely reflected in those dynamics. But what's also interesting is that that's probably one of the most obvious ways that we see this metaphysics of whiteness working. But I think that this actually goes back to the question that was posed earlier, is even if we were to eliminate what's happening with filhas de criação, the question isn't just about isolated cases. It's a systemic issue, right? And I think part of what you're arguing is that if we think about whiteness as having this metaphysical property, which I love the idea of, this metaphysical, latent, and diffuse property, then it really means that these smaller reforms, isolated reforms, aren't sufficient, but rather the entire system has to be redesigned. I like that suggestion. That's easier said than done, but I think that it's an important way to think about the road ahead. Thank you.
In a party. but I think it's important to talk about it, and maybe it's because it's important to for these things to come up and for us to talk about them. So there was an opportunity for us to try and show solidarity, but we were unable to take advantage of it. And I was happy to hear that there was a parliamentary front created in defense of indigenous peoples, and 200 members of parliament. So this is a good signal that theoretically it's possible to construct, because they're not going to be for everyone, but maybe in terms of thematic coalitions, we could create spaces and groups for resistance. I'm not the first person to talk about this, but I was reading recently about this, in fact, that the reforming the press is another way, another great opportunity. So the left could create an alternative on the that could show how things should be, and not the exclusive reform, but one that works with other people. And so I believe a lot in the capacity. My vision is that we have the capacity to create fronts of resistance based on thematic issues. And I think we were beginning to see this work. We thought it was just a kind of a perfunctory thing, but it's not. And the second part is, yes, that the lefts need to find the path to militance, to activism that's effective. And because I'm from São Paulo, I see clearly in the time of Haddad, Fernando Haddad, who I hold in high regard, but his incapacity to talk to those on the periphery, and he lost the periphery to the right in the elections. And okay, well, there was the car wash thing that complicated things, but he lost more than we anticipated of that population. And so I think it's possible to radicalize the discourse that's socioeconomic and in terms of identity, that we need to radicalize the militancy, but also be practical in terms of our actions in the government and the National Congress. I think that's one way in which we can kind of rebuild our base for 4 years from now. So 3 minutes. Okay. The left, is it democratic? I think, yeah. There are cases of people being undemocratic. Talking about Leninism without communism. There's been talk of that in the left, but communism. There are also the criticisms that communism ostensibly disappeared, but it actually is still functioning on the left. I think those are maybe true, but they're traces. They're not the majority. So I don't think that's the problem for the left. The big problem. The case of Amaral, I'm not even able to articulate what I think, because I would go to prison if I said what I really think. And for those who don't know this, Amaral, she's a young congresswoman who's from São Paulo, and in a debate, she just tore into the Minister of Education with statistics and arguments, and it was an excellent performance. And the left, instead of celebrating her victory, they criticized her and said that she was just an extreme leftist. So I agree with everything you said. I embrace everything you said. But I also, the question of the economists, I think I've talked to Haddad and others, and he knows about these problems, and there are people in the Workers' Party that know about these problems, that we need to make changes in the economy, that it needs to be kind of investigation and auditing. And so I talked to the Minister of Education for Dilma, and who kind of, he resigned after a time, and he's been writing about a lot of things that I think are really great. For example, the Social Security question, he's demonstrated a willingness to talk, and he's not just discarding and kind of pushing aside these kinds of issues that are being raised. He's willing to engage in dialogue about them, and I think he's right to do that. And I think in this article you talked about, the Workers' Party cannot kind of discard Haddad because he's good. the moment in which he campaigned was maybe not the right moment, but he's still a good figure for us to support, and he can't work on his own, and so we need to support him. And I think it's important to mobilize the intellectuals on the left who have more of an influence than they think. I think the Workers' Party respect the intellectuals on the left, and they could have been more outspoken in terms of discussing these problems and proposing solutions. So I haven't completely lost hope in this question. There are people that are discussing these things, and leadership, local leadership in terms of the Workers' Party, mayors and those kinds of things, they've had success. And there are people that are talking about the Social Security question and trying to make it more sustainable. But actually, the state problems are a lot worse than the federal problems in that respect. Now, so I think it's possible for people to address these problems, but I think we need to start a discussion and start proposing solutions for the Social Security question, and for Brazil's economy and the world economy, and things that are they're not the center of our debate, but they need to be talked about.